Ladies and gentlemen, the Brit Pack is back, and it has been a packed week of fights over the last 7 days. The UFC, well, the last 8 days, if we're being honest. The UFC were down there in Jacksonville, Florida, with not one, not two, but 3 fight cards down there in Florida, as the UFC became the first sporting league in America to bounce back from the coronavirus. We will address that on this week's show, while also looking back on some of the highlights of the midweek event, UFC on ESPN Plus 29, and last weekend's show, UFC on ESPN 8. But before all of that, let's introduce you to the other half, the better looking half of the Brit Pack, Shamakar Sandhu from over there in Toronto, Canada. How are you, buddy?
I'm good, mate. I'm good. And it's been a busy week, so I'm not going to lie. And it kind of, for the very first time, felt like what it was like before the pandemic. Just, you're busy, you're working, you've got things to do. And especially for us in the MMA space, no fights, especially no UFC events, and it tends to have a trickle-down effect with regards to how much work you've got, and what gigs you've got, whether you get paid. So I think on behalf of both of us, we're both thankful that the UFC did come back, put on 3 events, because it meant we were busy, which was good, and we've got lots to discuss, lots to talk about, tons of stories and fights to react to, and I can't wait to get in it with you today.
Yeah, it has been. It's good to be actually talking about real fights. It's been kind of up and down for me. It's been obviously having the 2 main gigs that I have. I write for MMA Junkie and I also write for RT Sport. I actually lost a gig this week, believe it or not. One of my other smaller gigs sort of fell by the wayside, but grateful for the big ones that I've got, and the one that did fall away, they're hopeful that might come back in the in the coming months. But that's the world we live in, right? Freelance writers and working in this space, and it is difficult. And I know that there are colleagues of ours out there who have lost gigs this week, who are outstanding members of the MMA media, who we hope will be back in the mix very, very soon. And having fights back on the screens is obviously something that will be very helpful to us all over the long run. So fingers crossed things start to pick up. But we've got loads and loads to talk about on this show, Sandhu. So let's just kick things off and kind of do it chronologically, really. Let's look back at last Wednesday night, midweek fights. You don't normally get those unless we're watching the Contender Series, which you never know. We might see that come back in a not too distant future. But we had a full-on UFC Fight Night event, UFC on ESPN Plus 29 at the VyStar Veterans Memorial Arena in Jacksonville. Glover Teixeira taking on Anthony Smith, and my goodness me, I think we both picked Anthony Smith for that fight, but Glover Teixeira proved that he's still very much a factor in that division. But it was a fight that, in the end, proved to be quite hard to watch by the time we got to the end. I don't know how you felt, Sandhu.
Yeah, I concur completely. The fight should have been stopped. Now, we can get into with regards to whether it would have been the corner throwing the towel in, or perhaps referee Jason Herzog calling off the action, perhaps at some point in the 3rd round, but definitely in the 4th or 5th, until the fight eventually was stopped late in the 5th round. But I think Anthony Smith took way too much punishment than he should have. In my opinion, I don't know what it is about MMA, but in boxing we see the towel getting thrown a lot more often. And I guess the best example of that in recent times is the Deontay Wilder fight with Tyson Fury. Deontay's corner threw the towel in when they knew that their man was taking way too much punishment. The fight's over, it's just a matter of time, and they threw the towel in. In MMA, the only one that comes to mind, and only because it's like a high-profile situation, was when Nate Diaz fought Josh Thompson, and his brother Nick Diaz threw in the towel. Now, it was a moot point anyway, because I think the referee had stepped in by that point in any case, but it just shows that Nick was willing to throw in the towel the minute Josh Thompson landed that head kick. The fight was done, it was over. Even if the referee hadn't stepped in to call it off, the towel was thrown in and the fight was over. We just don't see it often enough in MMA. We actually see it barely at all. And I'd love to get your take on it with regards to whether you think the referee should have stepped in first, or perhaps whether you think the corner should have stepped in first and called the fight off. And then we can, of course, get into the aftermath in terms of what Anthony has said since, what Jason Herzog has said since, and all the rest of it.
Yeah, I think while the fight is in progress, I think it's the domain of the referee. I think Jason Herzog's the guy in there while the fight is going on. I think he's the sole arbiter of whether the fight is stopped or not. I know the corner can throw the towel, but the referee decides whether the fight is stopped or not, and he's the sole arbiter of that. So I think in those circumstances, I think initially it's on the ref. But then this wasn't a situation where the beating took place during a round and then the finish happened and it was just a late stoppage. We actually spanned rounds, didn't we? We had a situation where Smith went back to his corner. His corner saw him at close quarters. They were talking to him and they obviously felt that he was good to go back out again. And I think at that point, the corner, maybe you can start to question whether they did the right thing by sending him out there again. And then obviously once the fight starts again, I think it falls much more in the realm of the ref. So I know the cornermen can technically throw the towel in, and the referee will always stop a fight if that happens. But I think that the burden of responsibility once the fighter was in the corner, I think the corner can have a really close-up look at him and make that call. And for whatever reason they didn't. They sent him back out there again. I know fighters don't like having fights stopped. It's completely understandable. And there was a very good piece on MMA Junkie, an interview that was done with John Hackleman, who was in Glover Teixeira's corner. And John has been criticised in the past, including by some of his own fighters, of stopping fights too early because he's someone who has thrown the towel in the past or pulled people out between rounds. And he says it's a very difficult balancing act to strike. But me watching that, I think once you start getting uncomfortable with the amount of unanswered damage that's being dished out, I think if you start getting uncomfortable, then you've probably seen too much already. And for people who have watched as many fights as we have, and certainly people who have officiated as many fights as Jason Herzog has, and for the guys who are cornering these fighters who've seen countless fights themselves, I would have liked to have thought that somebody would have stepped in and saved Anthony Smith a little bit earlier than they did. So, he's lost a few. I don't know if he's lost teeth. He's lost veneers, I think was what's said afterwards. It's irrelevant. He should. It's the blunt trauma to the head that I didn't like seeing. And granted, this is stock in trade in the sport. People smacking each other around the head. But the thing I do like about this sport is, as soon as it gets too much, as soon as someone's not intelligently defending themselves, 9 times out of 10 or 99 times out of 100, the fight will be stopped. And Jason Herzog, in general, is an excellent I think he's come out and admitted that he's, if he had that one again, he would call it earlier. So, I found it all a little bit uncomfortable. I think Glover found it a little bit uncomfortable. But thankfully, and fingers crossed, there's no lasting damage as a result of that.
Yeah, I mean, with regards to Jason Herzog, I commend him for coming out and making a statement because, to be honest, Simon, and we know this, very well, it's very rare for referees to do interviews or make statements on their social media feeds, especially when there's a controversial bit of action in a fight or a stoppage or lack thereof or whatever the case may be. And while I absolutely agree that Jason Herzog should have perhaps stopped the fight, I'm kind of split. I still feel like the corner should have done their job because I don't know what you're looking for. You put your fighter out there again in the 4th round and then again in the 5th round, and by the 5th round you must know you're down in the scorecards. You're looking for your fighter to give you something like a haymaker or just like a wild strike that'll knock Glover Teixeira out. And in the first minute to 90 seconds, when you see that that hasn't happened and Glover has gone back to dishing out punishment, you've only got a couple of minutes. Just throw in the towel. The fight's done. It's finished. What are you doing? And the thing with fighters, they're not going to blame their corner. And Anthony Smith has come out and obviously defended his corner, that they did the right thing. He's come out and said, hey, look, I'm the kind of fighter that will go out on my shield or come back on it. And every fighter's like that, male and female, they're all alphas, right? And I expect nothing less from fighters to say something like that. But that's why you have a corner to look after you. That's why there's a referee in the middle of the cage to protect you from yourself when the fight is done. So that was very unfortunate. I thought it took away a little bit, in my opinion, from Glover Teixeira's fantastic performance. Right, this guy Simon, he's older than us. He's 40.
Well, he's older than you.
Okay. I was trying to protect you a little bit there.
No,
so.
How old is he?
He's 40.
He's significantly younger than me, Sandu.
Okay.
I'm 44 this summer.
All right. Well, fair enough. Well, he's older than me, Simon.
He's a young lad. Yeah, go on. He's knocking on. He's knocking on a bit. MMA terms.
He definitely is. But you got to give respect. I mean, here he is. At 40 years of age, and he's put together a nice little win streak here, and he's capped it off with a main event win against Anthony Smith, and he's talking about trying to push for another title fight sooner rather than later, which I don't blame him for coming out and saying that. But now that we've had that fight in the books, we've got Dominic Reyes out there wanting a rematch, Simon, clearly, and that's a big money fight at the light heavyweight division. Jan Blachowicz has put together a fantastic run as well. You've got Glover Teixeira, who's inserted himself into the mix. And perhaps the bottom of the list, you still got Thiago Santos, who feels as though he won the fight against John Jones. He's wanting a rematch as well. And later on in the show, we'll get to the potential John Jones-Francis Ngannou, fight, or quote-unquote fight. But if John stays at light heavyweight and is looking to defend his belt next, we've got a nice kind of list of contenders there. Who do you think is the most deserving, Simon? Who's put together the best case to warrant getting a crack at John Jones in that light heavyweight title?
I think you have to do the Dom Reyes rematch. If he stays at 205, I think John Jones has to face Dom Reyes again. That was a very, very, very close fight. I mean, that was probably the closest fight that John Jones has had since the first fight with Alexander Gustafsson. Arguably closer. And I know a lot of people thought that Dominic Reyes won that fight. I actually thought that he'd done enough to win that fight. So I would run that one back. I think it's a rematch that needs to be made. I think Glover Teixeira versus Jan Blachowicz seems like a common sense matchup to make at this point as well. Thiago Santos is kind of a little bit out of the loop. I mean, he's not fought for a while. I know he's been rehabbing injuries. Obviously, I know he picked up some nasty injuries against Jones, so I think he'll probably need to go in there and maybe take on a Corey Anderson or someone along those lines, maybe, and then he's straight back in the mix as well. But I think the natural thing to do, is for Jones to face Reyes again. Get a definitive result there. This is assuming he stays at 205. And then have Jan Blachowicz take on Glover Teixeira, maybe September, October time this year. That would make a lot of sense to me. And have the winner of that move on to face whoever has the belt at that time, sort of towards the back end of this year, maybe sort of December time. So if we're looking at December time, maybe you bring that Teixeira fight a little bit earlier, sort of end of the summer sort of time, maybe July, August, maybe, just to give you the turnaround time. But yeah, I think that's what I would do. I think Teixeira, looking at the win streak, I mean, he's got 3 out of 4 of those fights on his 4-fight win streak have been finishes. Nikita Krylov is the only one who took him the distance, and that was a close fight. But if you stop Anthony Smith, I think you deserve to be right up there, and he's been there. And since he fought Jones, which was a fair while ago now, he's put together some decent wins, and I think he deserves to be one fight away. And I think the Jan Blachowicz fight makes a lot of sense. So that's what I would do. What about you? Are you a Reyes rematch guy, or do you think that he's had his chance and it should be someone else's go next?
No, I completely agree with you, Si. I want that Dominic Reyes rematch, as much as anybody else, because I actually scored it for him. I thought he beat John Jones. But the question is, what if John Jones moves up to heavyweight? And again, we'll get to the whole thing with Francis Ngannou next. But if he does move up, then what do you do at 205? Because then you've got Reyes, you've got Blachowicz, and you've got Teixeira, and a little bit lower down the list, you've got Santos. Do you do almost like a mini tournament with those four guys? Do you insert an interim title belt at 205? What do you do in that situation?
Well, I think it depends on what Jones does. I know, like, Jones could move up and just take like a busman's holiday and move up to heavyweight, but intend to come back down and carry on at 205 afterwards. You don't know. Does he want a bit of champ money? Does he want to hang on to the 205 belt and go straight for the title at 265? So it depends on if he relinquishes the belt. Then I think the common sense thing to do then is to do Reyes versus Jan Blachowicz, because Jan was there first. If you compare Jan and Glover Teixeira, Teixeira's just won his way back into the mix, if you like. Jan won his way there a little bit earlier. So I think he gets the first go at Dom Reyes, who for me is the clear number one contender at 205 right now. And you fight for the vacant belt. If John plans on coming back, then yeah, I guess you could sling an interim belt in there. But yeah, I think Reyes versus Jan would be my first match. And then you do Glover versus Thiago Santos in the other matchup. And the winner of that ends up facing the winner of the interim title or vacant title fight. And then I think you've then got the division back up and running again. I think that probably makes the most sense. But then you've got Anthony Rumble Johnson's knocking around. I don't know whether he initially said he was going to come back as a heavyweight, and then he talked about coming back at 205. So we don't know what his status is yet, whether he's even in the USADA testing pool yet. I think he was timing his moment to come back into the USADA testing pool. And then he's got to be in it for, I think, 6 months before he can fight. So he might have been in it for 2-3 months and we just don't know. But once he's back in the mix, and if he's in the mix at 205, then you can put him straight in there as well, because I was there when he absolutely destroyed Glover Teixeira. That was insane, that knockout of Glover Teixeira all the way back at UFC 202, which was the Conor McGregor Nate Diaz rematch in Las Vegas back in 2016. So I think he's back in the mix as well. But yeah, I think that's what makes the most sense. But whichever way you slice it, Dominic Reyes has to be fighting for a belt next time he gets into the cage. That's my opinion anyway.
What I like about 205 is we've now seen John Jones really, really, really pushed. In years gone by, all we had to, I guess, reference was that one Gustafsson fight at UFC 165. Apart from that fight, John Jones has steamrolled his way through the competition. But in the last year to 18 months, we've seen Thiago Santos really push him, right? And Dominic Reyes really push him, with some people out there scoring the fight for the opposition in both instances. And now we've also got a healthy list of contenders at light heavyweight, with win streaks and cases to be made to fight for the title. And so much is now riding on what John Jones does next, whether it's to move up and whether it's to stay at 205. It's definitely good to be John Jones, because he's got lots of options in his own weight class, but he's created a mouth-watering prospect of an option at heavyweight for himself as well. But I really like 205. I think for a while there it was looking a little bit stale. And I think of the bunch, Dominic Reyes is definitely the one that's broken through the best, just given his age, given what his potential ceiling is in that weight class. But at the same time, you still got some veterans. You got some guys that have been around the block who have put together a nice little win streak. For Teixeira, it would be a rematch. For Santos, it would be a rematch. For Reyes, it'd be a rematch, and rematches historically tend to do better than the original when there's a compelling case to be made. So yeah, like you mentioned earlier on, I'm definitely in the Dominic Reyes rematch camp if John Jones stays at 205.
And the other thing to note is what Glover Teixeira, Anthony Smith, even Thiago Santos, Dominic Reyes, what they all have in common John Jones didn't finish any of them. They went the distance with John Jones. Thiago Santos actually won the fight on one of the judges' scorecards. Dominic Reyes remarkably didn't, although he won it on a lot of media scorecards. Yeah, I mean, John Jones is winning these fights, but he's kind of game managing his way to some of these wins. And I think Dominic Reyes will push him even harder next time round. Arguably, Thiago Santos will push him even harder next time round. And I think Anthony Smith, if he ever found himself in a position to challenge again, he's got a bit of work to do, obviously, after the Teixeira loss. I know that he feels like he let himself down badly when he fought Jones first time round. So I do think the fact that Jones isn't putting these guys away like he was when he was on the way up, I think that tells you that the gap in terms of at least ability to finish fights, the gap is closing. Jones isn't able to put them away the way he used to. Either that or he's just doing the bare minimum to win fights, which I find hard to believe. So, but yeah, we have more on John Jones coming up later in the shows, Andy.
We absolutely do. And going back to controversial moments in a fight, especially when it comes to referees stopping or not stopping, as it were. A similar situation occurred on Saturday night when the UFC had their third event in a week, headlined by the Demolition Man, Alistair Overeem, versus Walt, the big ticket Harris. The result was Harris being defeated by Overeem via second round TKO. Obviously a very emotional night for Walt Harris and anyone really involved in the sport who's been following his story. Very emotional time for him. Give him all the kudos in the world for being able to check his emotions, try and focus on the fight. A fight that he perhaps was a few seconds away from winning in that first round. What did you make of Alistair Overeem getting absolutely pummeled by Walt Harris and Big Dan Miragliotta essentially allowing Overeem to survive and kind of squirm his way back and then eventually make a comeback in that second round, where I thought Harris had kind of gassed himself out in that first round, and somehow in some way Overeem's chin kind of held together. He survived that onslaught and then was able to turn things around and get that second round finish.
Yeah, I think the thing with Alistair Overeem is, if you're a referee and you're going in there and you're refereeing an Alistair Overeem fight, you've got a large body of work that you can call upon if you're doing your research into a fighter's tendencies, how they react when they're hurt and things like that. And there's no doubt about it, Alistair Overeem was in big trouble early on against Walt Harris. But what we have also seen from Alistair Overeem in fights is he has gone through the mill in the past and come out the other side and done well. And when he gets knocked out, he gets knocked out properly, if that makes sense. Like he gets knocked unconscious. He tends not to be stopped while he's conscious, if that makes sense. He seems to have a way of managing his way through tricky situations until he gets absolutely dusted. I think that might have been the case here. I mean, the referee, he clearly saw that Overeem was in trouble, but Overeem was at least showing signs of trying to defend himself, albeit while he was completely scrambled. So I can kind of understand it. I can also, if the ref had stopped it, I think it would have been very hard to argue against it. So in that respect, Walt Harris can count himself a little bit unlucky that maybe he didn't have himself a finish. But he didn't completely finish Alistair Overeem. There was still some fight left in him. And bit by bit, he worked his way out of trouble. And as Walt Harris's pace started to drop, Overeem took over. And the way the fight eventually finished was kind of sad, really, because it almost looked to me like Overeem didn't want to hit him with those ground strikes. Because normally, when you're in a position like that, especially in a heavyweight fight, and someone's turtled up like that, people are raining down monstrous blows at a rapid pace, just absolutely hammering away to get the ref to dive in and stop the fight. And Overeem, while he was obviously landing heavy shots, it was sort of one heavy shot and then waited for a bit, and then another heavy shot and then waited for a bit. I think he was almost waiting for the ref to think, do you know what, Harris is doing nothing to change his position and get out of this, I'm going to stop. And it took quite a few of those before it actually happened. So again, arguably you could you could say it was a late stoppage, or maybe a slow stoppage if you want to put it that way, because Harris took some shots that I don't think he needed to. He sadly I think he'd basically been broken by Overeem at that point, and he didn't have anything left, and he took shots that he didn't need to take. But yeah, I mean, if you'd have had a referee with a little bit more of a hair trigger, then Walt Harris would be walking away with the biggest win of his career right now, and Overeem will probably be wondering what he's going to do for the remainder of his mixed martial arts career, because I think the next time he loses, that may well be the last time we see him in the octagon.
Here's an interesting stat or factoid for you, Simon. Alistair Overeem now joins Alexei Oleinik as the only fighters in UFC history to have scored... the only fighters who have scored or registered wins in the 90s, the 2000s, the 2010s, and the 2020s. 4 different decades. They take a licking, but they keep on ticking, as they say. Alistair Overeem also cleared 400 grand. That was of the reported payouts for that event. He was by a country mile out in front in terms of his payday. And you have to think that when he's commanding that kind of money, the UFC are only ever going to use him, in those main event slots on these fight night cards, or perhaps, on a featured bout on a main card. And I feel like he's got himself back in a mix. Now, don't get me wrong. Like, I'm not saying he's going to go out there and, defeat Miocic or a Cormier or a Volkov or maybe even an Ngannou. But I feel like he's earned the right to say, hey, I am still around. I'm still in the mix, because he was only a few seconds away from winning in that Rosenstruck fight. And if that was a win, he'd be riding like a 5-fight win streak right now. He has called for a rematch against Rosenstruck, which I actually don't mind, Simon. Obviously, Rosenstruck's coming off a loss, so he wants to bounce back. And you fight over him, you're going to guarantee yourself a main event slot. What do you think about that idea?
Yeah, it's an interesting call out. I think Overeem is a very smart guy, and we've both had the opportunity to chat to him when he's had big fights over here in Europe, and he's a very, very smart guy. He manages his career very well. And I think he's had a look at the division, and there isn't really that much for him to do above where he's ranked right now. It's not like he can call out someone above him that's an obvious fight for him. I think Jairzinho Rozenstruik makes a lot of sense given the landscape of the heavyweight division right now. So Rozenstruik will want to get back in there as soon as possible. He got flash knocked out super quick, 20 seconds. By Big Francis, so he'll want a bit of time to just clear the cobwebs, and he'll be back in the gym again, and he'll want to get back in there with the Reem and have an even more decisive victory. Overeem, of course, he was winning that fight almost from start to finish, and then got busted up in the last half minute of the fight. Really, I think that makes a lot of sense. This is a fight that I don't think will ever happen. But as a matchup, I would be fascinated to see Overeem versus Daniel Cormier. Two guys who have been in this game for a while, but Alistair Overeem's takedown defense is pretty good. I mean, he's been around for so long. He's taken on a who's who, and his ability to control where the fight goes is up there with the best of them at heavyweight. So against someone like Daniel Cormier, I would be fascinated to see how he got on. And whether he could pick apart Cormier from range, especially using his kicks. But I suspect we won't ever get to see that matchup because of the situation with Cormier's career right now. He probably wants one more fight with Miocic, and that'll probably be it. But that's kind of a lost fight that I think we're going to wish that we saw one day. But yeah, the Jairzinho Rozenstruik fight makes a lot of sense, I think. And a word on just a quick word for Walt Harris. I thought, obviously, it's very hard to talk about without sounding completely patronising. But for him to get back in there and to compete and to do as well as he did, especially early on in that fight, huge hats off to him. And he was on a good run of form prior to everything happening in his personal life. Sort of tragic circumstances that he's had to deal with, and to even be able to come back after that is almost unfathomable to me. So for him to have come back is enormous. So I just hope that he doesn't take this loss to heart too much, that he goes back, looks at the tape and realises, do you know what, I had that fight in the palm of my hand and I just couldn't quite close it out. Look at the positives of that and then bounce back, because he had a wobbly start to his career in the UFC, but now he seems to have hit a bit of a sweet spot. Getting beat by Overeem is no disgrace, and I think if he goes back to the drawing board again, gets himself ready, comes back at the right sort of level, I think he can still make a run in the next 12 to 18 months, and you never know, we might be talking about Walter Harris in a number one contender fight at some point further down the line.
Yeah, well said. I thought he handled himself with lots of class and respect, and him and Overeem shared a nice little moment in the cage. You know, Overeem's a father as well, and it was a tough spot for Overeem. Just, you know, getting through fight week and getting to the fight, and it was almost one of those situations where I'm kind of glad there were no fans, because, you know, Overeem, no fault of his own, would have just got booed out the building for winning a fight, probably. You know what I mean? Because Walt Harris would have been such a fan favorite, everyone would have been cheering for him, and I think most people were cheering for him. You know what I mean? So, yeah, you know, pure class from both guys, and that was the end of of 3 fights in a week, Simon. And I have to say, I thought that UFC did a pretty good job. You know, you had Jacare testing positive, and 2 of his cornermen, and they caught it with the rigorous testing that they did do. Time will tell over the next kind of week to 10 days how everybody else fares in terms of, you know, going back home, going back to their various cities, locations, and whether everyone stays clean and healthy and negative from COVID-19. But from an operational standpoint, from a health and safety standpoint, being, you know, governed by the Florida State Athletic Commission, it was as close to a home run as I thought they could have done, given all of the circumstances. What did you think of the UFC, which essentially was the first real sport back since the pandemic hit?
Yeah, I mean, I said this on another show, or on another column that I wrote earlier this week. To be the first guys back puts an enormous amount of pressure on you as a company. It puts an enormous amount of pressure on Dana White as the figurehead of that company, because all eyes are on them. You know, to be the first guys out of the cave is, so to speak, to be the canary in the coal mine. You know, if things are going to go wrong, the chances are it's going to go wrong on your watch, because you're the first ones out. You know, you're the ones who are going to make the mistakes that the people who follow you are going to learn from, right? So to be the first ones out is a really tricky spot to be in. And under the circumstances, and we say this with a slight caveat, because it takes a while for people to know if they've contracted something and whether they can trace it back to being in Jacksonville. But as things stand at the moment, it looks to me like they've done a pretty good job. I mean, from a television product standpoint, I don't think they could have done much better. I think they did an outstanding job. Huge shout out to John Anik. Anybody who knows anything about John knows that the level of preparation he puts in for a fight night is just insane. And he had to do 3 of those in the space of 8 days, and 2 of them in the space of 4 days. So just to get through that, and broadcasting with different broadcast partners for each show, I thought he did an outstanding job. But I think from a TV standpoint, I thought it came across great. I don't think the events missed the fans as much as maybe some of us might have thought they may have done. I think what it did, it turned the event into a much more intimate TV product. You could really hear the punches. You could hear the interactions between the fighters. You could hear the cornermen. It gave it a completely different feel. But for a brand that once branded itself as real as it gets, to kind of strip away a lot of the razzmatazz around it actually made it feel even more real. So I don't think they suffered that much from that. From an operational standpoint, it looks to me like they've mitigated as much as they possibly could. I think they conducted like 1,100 tests or something over the course of the 8 days. And they had three positive cases, didn't they? They had Jacare and his 2 cornermen. And they isolated them straight away. And it looks as if that, the measures that they put in place have meant that the 2 shows that followed went off pretty much without a hitch. So, slight caveat because we don't know for definite what the upshot is after this, but it looks to me like they've done an outstanding job, and they've set the bar, really. They've kind of set the baseline for anybody else who hosts a live event. Obviously, different sporting events have different feels. I know they're looking at doing golf. I think they might even have started doing golf. I think Rory McIlroy and Ricky Fowler did some sort of charity event this week in Florida. The WWE are obviously doing what they're doing, but they're very internalized as well at the Performance Center. So there's lots of different things that you can take from this. NASCAR came back this week as well. So they're gradually starting to bring sports back here and there. And I think the UFC have kind of set the benchmark now for how to do it as safely as possible during this time. So thumbs up. I think they did a good job, and fingers crossed that they can get back to the Apex in Vegas, because once it's there, I think all the infrastructure is there to put on shows that look and feel even better than the ones we saw this past week.
Yeah, and you mentioned other sports returning. I think the Bundesliga, the German soccer league, returned this past weekend as well. And actually, on the weekend, I know the WWE has been running shows, and their competition, All Elite Wrestling, AEW, they've been running shows as well. Had some luminaries from the AEW camp in attendance on Saturday night. You had owner and I guess chief booker Tony Khan. He's essentially AEW's Vince McMahon, for those unaware. And you had Jim Ross in attendance on Saturday night, and they were tested. They were there to check out how the UFC were kind of running the operation. So again, I think Dana White said this before in his post-fight press conference / media scrum, that a lot of other sports and figures and other sports leagues are reaching out to the UFC to find out how they're running things, because I guess in some way, shape or form, they're giving some sort of blueprint. Are they giving a blueprint to team sports? No. But perhaps, pro wrestling can take a leaf out of their book. Perhaps boxing can take a leaf out of their book. If Eddie Hearn wants to put on boxing fights in his back garden, maybe he can hit up Dana White and find out the blueprint in terms of making sure everyone's
That's an
tested.
Outstanding story. There've been some mental stories about this. Obviously, the Eddie Hearn back garden story. He's done mock-ups of how his garden will look with the ring and the media center and all this. This is great. You mentioned the Bundesliga. I watched a lot of the Bundesliga this past weekend. And yeah, there's no fans. It actually did all right. I mean, it helped that the 2 games I watched had loads of goals in. Borussia Dortmund were outstanding. And I think the Bayern Munich game I watched as well, there were 3 goals in that. But in the Bundesliga, who is it? Borussia Mönchengladbach, who actually played away from home this week. But this coming week, they're playing at home. I think it's called the Commerzbank Arena. The Commerzbank Stadium. Obviously, the fans aren't allowed in. So what they've done is, there's a company out there who have basically said, okay, for €19, which if you're listening in the States is about 18 bucks, I think. You can have a cardboard cutout of yourself, like life-size cardboard cutout of yourself, and we will put it in the stands. And the money will go to local charities, which, good idea. And different teams are doing this sort of thing. Anyway, Borussia Mönchengladbach have sold 12,000 of these things. So this coming weekend, if any of you have got access to the Bundesliga, whether it's in the UK where I am on BT Sport, or whether it's overseas, whether you get it on ESPN, I'm not sure what channels it's shown on stateside and in Canada, but TSN or whatever. But look out for that. There's going to be one match played this coming weekend where there are going to be minimum 12,000 cardboard spectators watching the action. I don't know what happens when the ball misses and knocks a load of them over like bowling pins. So I'm going to go and stand them all back up again. I don't know. But also, Belarus did in the Belarusian league, who seem to be giving no shits about the coronavirus at all as a country. They put mannequins in the crowd and people could stick their faces on them. And in Korea, FC Seoul, I know this is an MMA podcast, but bear with me. FC Seoul in South Korea, they bought a load of life-size mannequin dolls, or at least that's what they thought they were, and put them all in the stands holding placards supporting FC Seoul in the Korean K-League. Until some eagle-eyed fans spotted out that these weren't just regular mannequins; they were actually sex dolls. So that got so that got flagged, and the club have had to issue some sort of grovelling apology to say, we wanted to portray a family image, and they put a load of sex dolls in the stand. So yeah, weird stuff going on with the coronavirus and sport right now. But the UFC, relatively free of weird stuff. They've just gone in there and done the business and put on three pretty good shows. I mean, 249 was outstanding, Sandy. That's one of the cards of the year, I reckon, so far.
I agree. And just to put a bow on the UFC and the 3 events in 1 week, I didn't know how much I'd missed the fans. And now that I've consumed 3 events, I don't think I missed them that much because of everything else that we've had and everything else we get during these broadcasts. It's so much more intimate. Every single strike you're hearing the fighters talk back and forth. You're hearing the corners. I love how everything else it's almost like with the crowds and the arena being so dimmed out and the spotlight just being on the octagon. I don't know, there's something about it. It's not like the Ultimate Fighter house. It's not like the Apex. There was just something about it that made it feel a little bit more raw and, like you said, as real as it gets. Now, don't get me wrong. When fans come back, it's going to be great because they do bring a fantastic atmosphere, especially to big events, title fights, pay-per-views, and all the rest of it. But until they come back, I'll be absolutely fine with the way the UFC are putting on these broadcasts because we're getting so much more, or we're getting something different that we would normally get when there are fans in attendance. So I'm all for it.
Definitely, yeah, I completely agree with that. I think this is the way it's going to be for a while. So I think get used to the sort of product that you saw on the TV over the last week, and hopefully we'll get these on a regular basis moving forward. And hopefully the likes of Bellator and One Championship will be able to follow suit in the coming weeks and months as well. Something else to potentially look forward to, and we alluded to it a little bit earlier on in the show, Sandu. Francis Ngannou obviously destroyed Jairzinho Rozenstruik in 20 seconds at UFC 249. And last week on the show, I think it was, I talked about the fact that he's now a major headache for the UFC's matchmakers because who can he fight? He wants the title shot, but he isn't going to get a title shot unless Stipe or DC somehow falls out. And they're trying to make that fight. So assuming that fight goes ahead, Big Francis is just the odd man out. You can't feed him a lower ranked guy because he will do them some serious damage. Chael Sonnen did an interview with Sky Sports this week in England, and he basically said, like, the matchmakers have got a sense of responsibility here because he's not just knocking people out. He's absolutely destroying these guys. And he said there's only 2 people in the heavyweight division who can defend themselves against someone like him, and that's Stipe and DC. Anybody else is just cannon fodder. So, given that, there's a bit of a problem with Francis Ngannou. What's he going to do? Is he just going to sit tight and be grumpy until the fight happens? Or is he going to have to find something else? Well, something else might have just fallen into his lap because Johnny Bones Jones has chirped up and has hinted quite strongly that he wouldn't mind stepping up to heavyweight and taking on Ngannou. And there's been a bit of a back and forth. And about 10-15 minutes before we came online, Sandu, Ngannou tweeted sort of a slightly menacing looking picture of himself saying, are you still there, Johnny boy? Or something like that. So, I mean, like, Ngannou is clearly bang up for this fight. Jones has been criticising Ngannou's wild striking technique. And Ngannou's just, he has no shits to give whatsoever. He's just, feed me John Jones and I'll show you what I can do. Do we want this fight now? Do we want this fight ever? Do we want it now? Does it make sense? And if you're John Jones or John Jones's manager, if you're Malky Kawa, And you said yourself, John Jones is a man with options right now. Does it make sense to take the Francis Ngannou option right now? Or should he just be staying at 205, clean house at 205, and then move up and maybe take an instant shot at the gold, having cleaned out all of the 205 division? It's a tricky one. What do you think?
It's a tricky one, but I think the answer is yes, in short. I think it's a fight I want to see. I think it's a fight you want to see. I think it's a fight a lot of people want to see. And there's so many ways to break this down and dissect what's happened, because it's not just the odd tweet. Like, Francis Ngannou and John Jones have been going back and forth now for quite a number of days. You've had John Jones tweet, you've had Francis Ngannou tweet back at him. You've had John Jones go into Francis Ngannou's comments section. They're breaking down speed and strength and reaction and timing and you know, fight IQ and all the rest of it, and it's great because, like, the fans are eating it up, the media is eating it up. There's been a ton of, you know, headlines and stories already written about this potential fight. Then you've got the idea of, you know, fans have been wanting to see John Jones go up to heavyweight for years already. And yes, you can say, oh, well, why don't we just wait, let him clean out the division? Well, here's the thing. He's been cleaning out the division. He's already knocked out and finished and submitted generations of light heavyweight fighters. And although some of the recent results may be a little bit below par for John Jones' standards, and you may not agree with the decisions, maybe, and, you know, the way I've kind of dissected it is, look, is John Jones at 205 maybe losing a step? As he gets older, is he perhaps losing a little bit of speed? At the same time, are fighters beginning to figure out how to beat him, or how to at least compete with him at 205? Whereas if John Jones goes up to heavyweight, all of a sudden, although he's got the frame of a big guy, he'll then still be the lighter, the quicker of the fighters when you compare him to a Francis Ngannou, when you compare him to a Stipe Miocic. And if he fought DC, I'd favour him again because he's already, you know, beaten DC in the past. But it's this prospect of John Jones going up to heavyweight, and then on the other side you've got Francis Ngannou, who, like you said, he's been knocking out guys left, right, and centre. He's a scary, scary guy, and of course Francis wants this fight, because can you imagine if you're the guy that absolutely obliterates the guy that many consider the greatest of all time, the guy that hasn't lost a fight, legitimately lost a fight? He should be able, the UFC should be able to promote John Jones as an undefeated fighter. Imagine if you're the first one that knocks him out and that's on your highlight reel. With or without championship gold, you've already cemented your legacy if you ever did that. So that's all interesting, but ultimately, and my biggest takeaway is, if you dissect the back and forth between these two guys, it's coming down to the money. Francis Ngannou says he wants this fight. John Jones has said, send the deal. But what is the deal the UFC would send? Dana White said in his post-fight press conference he doesn't think that these two guys really want the fight. So there's a lot of jockeying for position. There's a lot of politics being played out in public comments already, and it hasn't even been a week yet since these guys have been going backwards and forwards. But I'll give the two guys credit. What they have done is they have piqued fan interest. It's all anyone's been talking about for a number of days now. And it's the onus is now on the UFC and Dana White to see if this is a fight they can put together from a financial standpoint. Because I think both Francis and especially John Jones, I mean, he's put it out there. This for him is super fight money. Now, what does that super fight money look like? We don't know, because John Jones has been clearing some pretty big checks for a long, long time. But and also, I think if he went up to heavyweight to fight Francis Ngannou and beat Francis Ngannou, I think his days at 205 would probably be long gone, because that's your launch pad to go straight into a title fight against the winner of DC and Stipe. So this whole thing is very fascinating when you break down all the various layers to it, and I don't think it's going to be simmering down anytime soon. I think this is going to be a story that's going to be something we discuss and talk about for weeks to come.
Yeah, I mean, from just a style matchup point of view, I would love to see it. I also think from a tactical point of view, if you're John Jones, I think you stay at 205 and maybe you use the Ngannou fight to get a bigger payday against Dom Reyes. I think Yeah, you want Mega Bucks to face Francis Ngannou, moving up a weight class against this absolute knockout machine. You're gonna want them to bring everything, bring all the monies for that one. And the UFC might say, well, look, we can't do that yet. We can't do that. We haven't got fans back. We aren't going to get a gate for this. So at which point Jones can turn and say, all right then, if you can't do that, do this. Shave a bit off and give me Dom Reyes. And so you end up facing Dominic Reyes on a bigger payday at your natural weight class. And then you get the chance to set the record straight there at 205. I'd love to see it at heavyweight at some point, though. I mean, I was always fascinated at the prospect of John Jones facing Rumble Johnson, and we never saw that. They were booked and then it didn't happen. But I would love to have seen that fight for a very similar reason to why I think people would enjoy seeing him take on Francis Ngannou. But obviously Ngannou is even bigger, even stronger, and even more terrifying than possibly Anthony Rumble Johnson. That's a heavyweight fight I'd pay to watch, by the way. Rumble Johnson versus Ngannou at heavyweight would be fun. But yeah, I just think the common sense move here is to stay at 205. If John Jones says, do you know what? I'm done with 205. Let's just do this. I know I can beat this dude. I'm going to go up there. I'm going to beat Ngannou. And then I'm going to beat the champ. Imagine he goes in there and beats Ngannou. And then DC beats Stipe. Does DC hang on for just one more, to beat John Jones at his natural weight class rather than having to kill himself to get to Jones's weight class each time? I've always thought that Cormier's best chance of beating Jones has been at heavyweight, because I know Cormier struggles to make 205. So Cormier at heavyweight is a different animal. So I would love to see that. But for that to happen, Jones needs to step up now and have a signature win, arguably, over someone like Ngannou, to then say, go in, beat Ngannou, and then say, come on in, DC, let's see what you got. Let's do it one more time for old time's sake. And that would just be the ultimate. That would then be the biggest fight in UFC history, probably. So, but yeah, sensible Simon says face Dominic Reyes. Crazy Simon says go in there and face Francis Ngannou and show everyone that you are the best fighter to ever grace the octagon. But the risk is massive, so you need the payday to go with it. And I'm not sure if the UFC, with no fans right now, and having had no fans since March, I don't know if they're going to be in a position to stump up for that just yet.
Yeah, it's definitely a risk versus reward here. And what's fascinating is just earlier on today, there were some betting lines available for the first time on a potential John Jones-Francis Ngannou fight, with a caveat that the fight has to take place in 2020. And John Jones is the betting underdog right now against Francis Ngannou. So I've got a question for you, Simon, and I want you to give me what you think would be the most dangerous fight for John Jones to accept right now of the following three options. Number one, Israel Adesanya moving up from middleweight to light heavyweight and fighting John Jones at 205. Option number two, the rematch against Dominic Reyes at 205. Or option number three, fighting Francis Ngannou at heavyweight. Of those three scenarios, which fight do you think would have the biggest chance of John Jones losing, or the most likelihood of John Jones losing in those three set situations?
That's a really good question, because I was all ready to give you an answer straight away when you said which one's the most dangerous, because it's pretty obvious which one the most dangerous one is. Standing in front of Francis Ngannou is bad for your health. So I think from a danger perspective, it's Francis Ngannou. But if you're looking at... that's a really tough question. I mean, Dominic Reyes arguably beat him before, but he has now fought Dominic Reyes. And I think John Jones tends to do better in rematches. So you could argue that he's in a better position to beat Reyes second time round. Israel Adesanya, I think, would be a very interesting matchup, and that's a fight I would love to see. I don't know if Adesanya might be slightly overmatched in terms of the size, though. That's my only concern. Adesanya is bigger than the most from a height and range perspective at middleweight, but John Jones is a big guy. He's got like an 84-inch reach. I think that's the biggest reach. The only guy with a reach that's close to that is Ngannou himself. I think Ngannou's got like 83 or 82. So, but yeah, I'd be interested to see that. I've got to say the one that presents the most risk is probably the Ngannou fight, because I could see Jones. I don't think Israel Adesanya is going to knock out John Jones, at least not early on. I think if that happened, it would be over a lengthy period, during which time I think Jones could potentially take control of the fight. Dominic Reyes gave Jones everything he could handle in the first fight, didn't put him away. Francis Ngannou could knock him out with one punch. And while from an all-round MMA technique standpoint, he is I think it's fair to say, the least skilled of the three. I also believe that his ability to turn someone's lights out, he wouldn't even have to catch Jones clean, and it'd be night time. So I think Francis Ngannou is the one that poses the biggest risk. Because the other thing, of course, is Jones has the size advantage over Adesanya. He's pretty much even with Dom Reyes, but he'll be conceding anything from about 20-30 pounds possibly to Francis Ngannou on fight night. So I think that the deck is stacked against him, against Ngannou, and just that punch power. Jones could just wrestle him for 5 rounds. That's entirely possible, but every fight, every round starts standing up, and Ngannou only needs to hit you once. So that having sort of strung it out far too long, I'd say Francis Ngannou. What do you reckon?
Yeah, I'm in the same boat. I think the Ngannou fight would be the most dangerous, and the likelihood of him losing would be, the chances of that would be very, very high in my opinion, because I think with Israel Adesanya, he'd have a size and a weight advantage over him, with Israel having never fought at 205 in MMA before. With the Reyes fight, I kind of like the idea of John Jones being able to dissect his first performance against Reyes, and he's got such fantastic fight IQ that any errors and mistakes he made in the first fight, I think he'd be able to correct in a rematch, and we saw how he did against Gustafsson the second time around. So if that's going to be your case study to say, well, how would you fare against someone who gave you a real run for your money? Well, we saw what he did to Gustafsson the second time around. Yeah, I mean, with Ngannou, he doesn't have a size or weight advantage over him, and Ngannou is such an imposing figure. And like you said, he doesn't even need to catch him clean. If he just clips him, it's lights out. It's good night. It's game over, And Francis Ngannou right now, and it's funny that he did the Mike Tyson podcast just a couple of days ago, because he is turning into the Mike Tyson. He probably is the best example of a Mike Tyson figure in our sport at heavyweight, especially on this recent run, because while he was doing the business in his first run up until he fought Stipe Miocic, there's something that's changed, and I think he's finally putting everything together. I feel like his composure, his strength and conditioning is better, and even though the way he approached Rozenstruik before the knockout was pretty wild in terms of him just throwing haymakers, I'd like to give him some credit with regards to how I think he would approach the John Jones fight. I don't think he'd be a wild berserker by any means. So it's interesting, though. It's given us a lot to talk about, because I don't think the next UFC event's going to be until May 30th. That's the date that the UFC have targeted, although there isn't a location set just at this minute. So in the interim, it's definitely got the MMA community buzzing for a potential fight between John Jones and Francis Ngannou.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And we're in that kind of rebuilding stage. Now we know we've got fights back. We're almost in fantasy fight booking territory now. Normally what happens is you're going week to week, and the fights almost book themselves in a lot of senses, especially at the highest level. You've got people on certain career trajectories, and they sort of naturally come together, and the fights kind of book themselves. We've had a bit of time off, and now we sort of take a look at the lightweight division as an example. I mean, Khabib Nurmagomedov, who knows when he's going to fight right now? I mean, he's going through absolutely horrific times right now back home in Russia. I understand his father Manap is back in a coma again. and he's on life support right now. So sending all our best wishes to Khabib and his family over there in Dagestan. Hopefully he will be back at some point this year to defend his belt against Justin Gaethje. That fight is pretty much set. I mean, champion versus interim champion. We kind of know that's the next fight to make. But the lightweight division is one of the most exciting divisions in the UFC, and you can make matches all over the place. I've noted some matchups down. I'm sure you've got a few in mind as well. If we're going to give this division a kickstart, what matches do you want to see? Obviously, we know we've got a championship match there, but what about the guys underneath to sort of build up the momentum again for everybody over the next few events? What fights do you want to see in this 155-pound division?
Well, the one that's screaming to me at the moment, and the one that I feel's got a little bit of momentum just due to some recent social media activity, is Conor McGregor, Nate Diaz, the trilogy fight. I feel as though, and again, whether it takes place at lightweight, whether it takes place at welterweight, I'd like it to take place at 155 because I think that's where both guys are at their absolute best. And also then you've got like a logical path to actually go for a title, especially if Conor McGregor were to win that fight. But when you look at Justin Gaethje winning the interim title, that's your ticket. That is your ticket for the undisputed championship against Khabib Nurmagomedov. Now, again, like you mentioned, with Khabib's situation with his old man going through what he's going through, who knows if he's going to be fighting anytime soon. I saw that him potentially coming back in July was something that was tabled by UFC President Dana White. But this is a developing story with his father and his health and his physical condition, and hopefully he pulls through this okay. And from what I've read, it's not just his father; it's other members of his family, friends, his circle and his network of friends and family over there. There's been multiple people that have contracted COVID-19.
20, apparently.
Yes, that's an insane number. And I've seen, the numbers have been spiking in Russia anyway. So the fact that 20 people close to him have tested positive, that's not that surprising, but still very, very shocking, to say the least. So Conor McGregor, Nate Diaz, that's got to happen. Now, Tony Ferguson, he is Wolverine, Simon. So he didn't need to have surgery to get his orbital fracture sorted out. So let's see how quickly he comes back. But I still think even if he's healing naturally, he's going to be out for a minute. I do like the idea of him potentially fighting Dustin Poirier at some point down the road. I would love to see those two match up. And with Justin Gaethje, man, I think you have to hold out. Even if Khabib's going to be out for a while, maybe September, October, end of the year, the opportunity to fight not only for the undisputed lightweight championship, but also to have a crack at an undefeated all-time great in Khabib. Those opportunities don't grow on trees. Because, and also, it's not as if he wouldn't get paid really well against Khabib because he's now holding a title, so he's getting pay-per-view points. It's not going to be Conor McGregor money, but Khabib is still very much a big draw in this sport. But you beat Khabib, you're going to get the Conor fight anyway, right? So I think with Justin, you have to hold tight. Just bide your time. If you're able to fight Khabib sooner rather than later, great. If it's later, so be it. And then in the meantime, I think with Conor and Nate, you finish the trilogy because I don't want to see them do this in 3 or 4 years as some sort of novelty fight. They're both still very much in their prime. There's a story to be told there. It's 1-1. And also it's a very winnable fight for Conor McGregor. And I think if you're the UFC, that is your golden goose. You want to keep putting him in situations where he can win fights, or you think the likelihood of him winning fight is very, very high. And against Nate Diaz, the probability of him winning would be high. And then also you can legitimately say, okay, look, he's come back. He's won 2 fights. Once against Cowboy, once against Nate. Now we can put him into a title fight rather than fast track him, which would just have people in uproar, kind of talking about the legitimacy of rankings and being able to actually earn your way to a title fight again. So those are some fights that I'd like to see. What about you, Si?
I've actually put 5 fights together here.
Oh, here we go. All right.
I've put 5 fights together. Now, these are fights that I would like to see. These aren't necessarily fights that I think will happen, because there's at least one that's going to jump off the page, and some people are going to listen to this and go, what is he talking about? But bear with me. The Khabib Gaethje fight is a given, right? So we'll bet without that. We'll start towards the sort of lower end of the rankings. Diego Ferreira and Charles Oliveira need to fight. I want to see those two against each other. Oliveira's on a 7-fight win streak. Ferreira is in the best form of his career. He's on a 6-fight win streak. They're both fighters that no one else really wants to fight, so they should fight each other. One of them will have a significant win streak and can then catapult themselves up the division. So I'd match those two. Islam Makhachev and Kevin Lee have been talking about fighting for the last 2 years, as far as I can make out, and yet they haven't. So put those two together. I think that's an interesting fight. I know Kevin Lee moved up to 170 and he seemed quite happy up there, but things haven't quite gone his way. So maybe he's coming back down to 55. He had that massive knockout of Gregor Gillespie last year. I'm sure people remember that. One of the best head kicks we've seen in a long time. And there seems to be a little bit of beef between Lee and Makhachev. So book that one. We'll have that one. Here's the controversial one. Conor McGregor against Paul Felder. Now, the reason why I'm going Conor McGregor and Paul Felder is I don't think Nate Diaz is ever fighting at 155 again. I just can't see it. I don't think he needs to cut down. I don't think championship belts are that important to him. And the only reason for him to go back to 55 really is if he's going for a belt. He'll fight at 70 if he fights again, or maybe 65 at some sort of weird catch weight if the UFC ever lets people fight at 65. So if he fights Conor, it'll be at 70. So if we bet without that, because we're talking 155 division, Paul Felder versus Conor McGregor, I think would be a very, very, very interesting, entertaining fight. Felder doesn't get knocked over easily. He's as tough as they come. He will stand and throw leather with you until the last bell. He has no problem at all. He's been in there with the likes of Barboza and has taken untold punishment and kept on going. He's been in there with Dan Hooker and has taken untold punishment and kept on going. That's the sort of fight where it could bring the best out of Conor McGregor, and I think you would get to see the best of Conor McGregor as a striker, because that would just be a pure stand-up war, and I think it would be a phenomenal fight. Felder may not be the big box office opponent that someone like Nate Diaz might be, but if you're talking about people who put on entertaining, exciting fights, Paul Felder's body of work stands up against anybody you can think of at 155. He's outstanding, and he deserves a big fight, and they don't get much bigger than Conor. So why not put the Irish Dragon against the King of Ireland? Make it happen. Also, Dustin Poirier and Dan Hooker. Dan Hooker is one of my favourite guys to watch at 55. Dustin Poirier is always there or thereabouts. He needs a win after losing to Khabib last time. So he's going to need to face someone a little bit lower than himself, get a win and get himself back up there. Dan Hooker for me is the perfect opponent. He's on a 3-fight win streak. He's beaten James Vick, Al Iaquinta and Felder. And I think he's in a position now where if he can knock over someone like Dustin Poirier, he's a legit contender. So for me, that's an interesting fight. So those fights that I've mentioned there are specifically with a view to getting the division started again. Someone who I haven't matched but I really want to see get a big fight is Drew Dober. Drew Dober had an outstanding performance during the week against Alexander Hernandez, who is ranked or was ranked 15th. I don't know if he still is. Dober should hopefully take his place in the rankings. Then he's looking up. Maybe someone like, just quickly thinking about the rankings, someone like Al Iaquinta maybe is sort of in the mix but isn't really getting any kind of matchup. So maybe Dober versus Iaquinta could be a lot of fun as well. Both of those guys like to stand and trade. That would be a fun fight. So we'll chuck that one in the mix as well. But they're the ones I would go for just to get the division up and running. And but I think if Conor faces Diaz, it'll probably be outside of the division. Let's not forget he's only fought twice at 55 as well. Sandu. He fought against Alvarez, won the belt. Fought against Khabib, didn't win the belt. Will he fight a contender at 55 to get himself into position, or is he just going to move himself around and wait for his shot? We will have to see. I suspect probably the latter.
The only reason I think Diaz and McGregor would fight at 155 is that was kind of like the parting shot. After McGregor beat Diaz in his post-fight press conference, he essentially said, and this kind of has stayed in my memory, that the next time and the final time that they fight would be at 155. The only reason McGregor gave him the rematch at 170, he was so hell-bent on essentially having the rematch with Diaz second time round be exactly what Diaz asked for the first time, the same circumstances, the same weight class. But I do remember Conor specifically saying the next time and the final time they fight, it would be at his weight class, which is 155. Although having said that, I wouldn't mind Poirier versus Diaz either. They were booked to fight not too long ago, and that fight never materialized. And I think that'd be a great fight on paper, anyway. So, and I know that Poirier's mentioned Diaz a few times as well on social media, and so he's chirped up about that fight as well. Whether he gets it, who knows? I'll tell you what, though, Simon. While we've been recording, it has come to my attention that we do have a main event booked for the yet to be determined location for the UFC's return on Saturday, May 30th. You got Tyron Woodley versus Gilbert Burns in the main event at welterweight, and I just feel for Leon Edwards right now because he was poised to take on Tyron Woodley in the main event of UFC London a couple of months ago. A win over Woodley in a main event of that particular fight night card, and that would have been your ticket to go for the title next. So, first of all, great fight. Don't get me wrong. Woodley versus Burns, sign me up. That's going to be a cracker, especially with the run that Burns is on right now. But where does Leon Edwards go from here? Who do you match him up against? Do you just wait to see what the result of this fight is? And if it's Woodley, do you still book the Woodley fight again? Or where do you go? What do you do if you're Leon Edwards right now, Simon?
Leon Edwards is kind of like the odd man out. He's on the outside looking in, and it's completely circumstantial that he's in that position. You know, he should be facing Tyron Woodley. I think he would have beaten Tyron Woodley, especially with the fight being originally booked for London. I think he would have won that fight. I genuinely believe that. And then he's knocking on the door of a title shot. But because of the pandemic, he can't travel to the States. So that rules him out of any fight against an American athlete at this point. So he's basically, Leon Edwards cannot wait for Fight Island to come quick enough, because once Fight Island's up and running, the door is then open to get people in and out, presumably. And then they can start hosting international fights. I'm looking down the list in the welterweight rankings. There's no one within shooting distance of Leon Edwards who isn't based in North America or Brazil. So it really makes him the odd man out, and I feel for him massively because he has always been that odd man out. He's always been the unfashionable opponent. He's the guy that no one wants to face. Kamaru Usman was exactly the same until he got the belt. Now they have to face him. And oddly enough, Leon Edwards and Kamaru Usman is the one fight in that division that has a backstory to it. And it's just circumstances getting in Leon's way. And I really do feel for him. And I hope that he can get matched up with someone soon. Looking at it, if Woodley's taken up, we don't know what Colby's going to be doing next. Masvidal is likely to be challenging for the belt. Would Leon end up matched up with Colby? Because if he isn't, he's then having to fight someone ranked beneath him, which is going to do absolutely nothing for his stock. So he's in a really tricky position. The best thing he can do is he needs to get back into action somehow. I don't quite know how this is going to happen until Fight Island happens. The best thing for him, though, would to end up on the same card as Kamaru Usman somehow, and at least get himself on the same timeline. And then if there's an issue with weight cuts and things like that, he might get a last-minute opportunity to step in. But I'm looking at these rankings, and there's not a lot there for him. I've got to be honest. There really isn't. He's going to end up having to fight someone ranked below him, and that's a fight with big risk and very little reward. So I'm gutted for him right now because he should be facing Tyron Woodley, and I'm really disappointed that they haven't looked to make that as maybe the first main event on Fight Island.
Yeah, this Fight Island situation, it's intriguing because we haven't really had any concrete news from the UFC at all about this. It's a lot of kind of like, yes, it's coming and we've secured an island, but no real hardcore concrete information. And I feel for guys like Leon Edwards, Darren Till was supposed to fight Robert Whittaker in August. You've got the biggest star in the sport in Ireland, who's also waiting for Fight Island, right? So you've got all these British and Irish and European fighters and some of the biggest names, some of the biggest draws in the sport that are all waiting for this island to be available so that they can actually get booked for fights because of the travel restrictions. And at the moment, the UFC is limited to picking and choosing the guys that they have available to them within the US. And unfortunately for them, there's a lot of big camps. There's ATT, there's Jackson Wink, and tons in between that are able to have fighters available to them. It'll be interesting to see what happens because Conor McGregor has come out and said, hey, look, I've seen what the UFC product looks like. He's seen the protocols and he is well up for fighting on Fight Island. But whether that is an actual thing, I mean, the UFC have printed t-shirts, Simon. There's actual merchandise that they're selling on the UFC store with Fight Island all over it. So let's see what happens. I'd love it, though. I'd love for this island to be a reality, not just from the optics and from the visual of what that would look like, but to actually give some of these guys around the world, guys and girls, an opportunity to fight.
Yeah, I find it hard to visualize. I mean, I can only imagine it's in the Caribbean. That's the only place where I can imagine it being, where people can get in and out. It's a small enough place where they can hold it. But also the climate is such that it's relatively consistent. But yeah, and it's also outside of US jurisdiction as well, which it would need to be. So yeah, I just don't know. Maybe that's the blessing in disguise. I mean, Leon Edwards was born in Jamaica, right? So who knows? Maybe this Fight Island thing could be right. It could be like a second homecoming for him, and he could be the main event. Who kicking this thing off against, I don't know, maybe fights Colby or someone, and he ends up with the whole of the Caribbean sort of looking to chase Colby off the island. I don't know, but it's a weird situation, and as it stands right now, it absolutely sucks. If you're Leon Edwards, I'm gutted for him.
Yeah, from all the information we know, it looks like either the Apex in Vegas or perhaps a location in Arizona seems to be where the UFC are headed next. And if all else fails, they can always go back to Jacksonville, which we know is tried and tested and proven location for them to hold events. But it'll be interesting to see how this all plays out. We've got a couple of weeks now until the next UFC event. So by the time we get back on the blower again next week, Simon, I'm sure we'll have some new information and updates for all the listeners. But until then, what we need the listeners to do is get on the list, and that is at thebritpack.substack.com. As we've mentioned in previous weeks, we really want you guys to sign up on our Substack website. That's where we're going to really grow the podcast, grow the show, and start to engage with you guys there. If you want to follow us on social media, it's at the Britpack MMA on Twitter. Simon is at Simon Head on Twitter and at Simon Head Sport on Instagram. I am at Sandu MMA across the board on all social media channels. And for those of you that are listening on Apple Podcasts, do us a favor, leave us a rating, leave us a review. That is how the Apple platform really helps us grow, is when listeners leave a review and leave a rating. So that would be much appreciated. And if you do, we'll perhaps shout you out on the show and read your review out in future episodes.
Awesome. Great stuff. Thanks to Sandu, as always, for joining me. It's always good catching up as well. It's we have a little catch up just before we go live, and then we just start talking fights. It's great. And as Sandu says, we've got about a week or so before we probably start to run up to the next show. It looks like the 30th of May is going to be our next one. So hopefully we will have more of a fight card to pick over on next week's show. That would be good. And if you've got any questions for the show, then hit us up on social media at any of those handles that you just heard, and maybe we'll drop a few questions in on next week's show. That's pretty much all we've got for you on the Brit Pack this week. go on the britpack.substack.com and sign up. Give us a follow on social media, and stay safe out there, and we'll speak to you in a week's time.